This is Land of Havilah, Psalm 41. It's 13 verses. Verse 1. For the chief musician, a psalm by David. Blessed is he who considers the poor. Yahweh will deliver him in the day of evil. Yahweh will preserve him and keep him alive. He shall be blessed on the earth, and he'll not surrender him to the will of his enemies. Yahweh will sustain him on his sickbed and restore him from his bed of illness. Comment in verse 1, blessed is he who considers the poor, end quote. The Hebrew word for poor there, the root of it means dangling. It might describe someone dangling by a thread, for example, not just someone poor in the financial sense. It means anyone in a vulnerable condition. So blessed is he who considers the financially poor, yes, but also the vulnerable, weak, humble, downtrodden, oppressed, and so on. Rather than taking advantage of him or piling more troubles on him, blessed is he who appreciates his situation and helps him. God will return the favor in verses 2 to 3. He'll help him when he's down. He'll preserve him, keep him alive, bless him on the earth, not surrender him to the will of his enemies, sustain him on his sickbed, and restore him from his bed of illness. Coming up, speaking of hanging by a thread, that describes the speaker right now, verse 4. I said, Yahweh, have mercy on me. Heal me, for I've sinned against you. My enemies speak evil against me. When will he die and his name perish? If he comes to see me, he speaks falsehood. His heart gathers iniquity to itself. When he goes abroad, he tells it. All who hate me whisper together against me. They imagine the worst for me. An evil disease, they say, has afflicted him. Now that he lies, he shall rise up no more. Comment in verse 8, an evil disease is another narrow translation. It's also translated deadly thing, thing of ruin, and wicked thing. So it's not necessarily just an illness. It's anything that dealt a blow to him so that it looks like he might not recover. His enemies think he won't recover, which suits them just fine. They'll be glad when he perishes in verse 5. They pretend to be his friends. They come to see him and give him well wishes, but inwardly they imagine the worst of him, then go away and speak the worst of him in verse 6. In verse 4, the speaker has humbled himself before God, confessed his sin, and asked for healing and restoration. Now speaking of one of those so-called friends, verse 9. Yes, my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate bread with me, has lifted up his heel against me. Comment, the Apostle John cited that verse as a prophecy of Judas, John 13:18. Judas was Jesus' familiar friend who ate bread with him at the Last Supper and then went straight out and betrayed him, verse 10. But you, Yahweh, have mercy on me and raise me up that I may repay them. By this I know that you delight in me, because my enemy doesn't triumph over me. As for me, you uphold me in my integrity and set me in your presence forever. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, from everlasting and to everlasting. Amen and amen. Comment, oftentimes in the Bible there are words and phrases that seem like figures of speech, but later it turns out that the phrase was a prophecy with a literal fulfillment. For example, in Isaiah, the voice of one crying in the wilderness turned out to be an actual person crying in an actual wilderness. The voice was John the Baptist, Matthew 3:3. There's another example in verse 10. The speaker asks God to raise him up that he may repay his enemies. It sounds like a figure of speech, but literally God raised Jesus up, Matthew 28:6, and he'll be repaying his enemies, Isaiah 63:1-6 and Psalm 110:1. Who would have thought it would be fulfilled by someone being raised from the dead, and that his repayment of his enemies would be so sweeping and complete, and that his enemies would be not just his own, but God's enemies and our enemies, and that one man would take revenge on all of them in one fell swoop. In general, in this psalm, there's a blurring of the lines whether the psalmist is speaking of himself or of Jesus or of us. In verse 4, the speaker says, I've sinned against you. That's the one verse that couldn't apply to Jesus. All the rest of it could apply to Jesus or to anyone if the shoe fits. So as we read, we examine ourselves, and if the shoe fits, it's for us. Psalm 42 is next.